The U.S. election now just 14 days away. We're going to talk about how Americans actually cast their ballots. Solange Mougin joins me in the studio to do just that. Hi, Solange.
Hi, Jeannie.
So to illustrate just how complex voting can be in the United States, you've actually brought a very precious envelope with you, haven't you?
I have indeed, my ballot, my mail-in ballot, because I think it really illustrates quite well how complex and what a hodgepodge of rules there are to voting in the U.S. And why isn't it simpler? Well, because the rules on who to vote, how to vote, well, it's basically decided for largely by the states and by jurisdictions. And there are some 10,000 jurisdictions and 176,000 precincts that set many of these rules in the United States. So in the county that I am from, you have inside this ballot, you have the envelope that you send it to. You have the envelope that you sign. You can have it witnessed on the back if you cannot sign it yourself. All the writing is both in Spanish and in English. And inside of that, you have this mega ballot. There are some 20 people that I need to vote for. The president, the senators of the U.S. Senate, but also the senators from states. There are 4 levels of judges, state judges, family judges, town judges, as well as the representatives of the U.S. and also the New York State Congresses. I'm from New York. On the back, this year, there are 3 local propositions in my county. One is about whether or not to protect against unequal treatment and whether that should be added to the New York State Constitution. And then these 2 others right here, well, they are really very specific about the town that I am from, about a parkland and about water quality in my area. All of this to show you that when you vote in the U.S., it is a far cry from one piece of paper that you stick in an envelope like here in France. Of course, there are a few nationwide rules that were added to the U.S. Constitution. But beyond those constitutional amendments and laws, it is pretty much up to states and jurisdictions to decide the rules.
Which is so fascinating because seeing your bulletin is so different from the one I sent in for Wisconsin. It's really incredible. Mm-hmm. So just why are there so many different rules? Talk us through this history of this decentralized voting system.
Well, the founding fathers of the U.S. Constitution, they basically decided not to include any specifics, leaving it up to the states. Already in the colonies, there were lots of different practices. George Washington, first president of the U.S., well, in his bid or before that to be part of the colonial Virginia's House of Burgesses, it was kind of like the House of Lords in the colony, he invited voters over for beer and barbecue. And back then, he did. And back then, and even after independence, people would vote viva voce, or they would say out loud who they were voting for, either verbally or actually physically with their bodies. The word polling comes from the practice of counting heads as voters walked from one side of the commons to another. Another tidbit, the word ballot, it comes from placing a small ball or a bean, a kernel of corn, or even a bullet into a candidate's pile or not. Now, the practice of anonymous secret voting, it really didn't come into place until something that was called the Australian ballot. And it gained popularity and was made into law in Australia in 1856. It is a single ballot that is provided for you that has all of the parties on it. And this kind of ballot caught on essentially because of poverty. The idea being that a poor person's vote could not easily be bought for, say, a meal or something like that because it was anonymous and secret. But this progressive advance, it also had a darker side. It was a way of effectively disenfranchising anyone who could not read the paper ballots in a private booth. Today, literacy is less of a problem in most places than it was in the 1800s and early 1900s. But there are other ways of restricting how and who can vote.
Right. So what are some of these ways that the current voting rules can either help you vote or hinder you from voting?
Well, after Donald Trump's false claim that the 2020 election was fraudulent or stolen, there has been an increase in voter restrictions. In 2024, this year alone, the Brennan Center for Justice says that there have been 18 new laws in 9 different states, most of them pushed for by Republicans. All of this, despite the fact that researchers and courts have found that voter fraud is exceedingly rare in the U.S. So a prime example of this is voter ID laws. Since 2020, 8 states have imposed new voter ID laws. That's potentially restrictions on 29 million eligible voters. Today, in total, there are 12 states that now have very, very strict ID rules, including 4 of the 7 swing states. Now, you could argue, what's the big deal? Just go get the ID that you need. But the University of Maryland, did a study, and it found that nearly 50 million people who are of voting age in America, who are eligible to vote, they do not have what is required. And minority voters are all the more vulnerable here, especially since the U.S. Supreme Court loosened oversight on such things in 2013, further paving the way for very specific and potentially disenfranchising laws.
No, it really is. That is a hot button issue. What are some other ways in which all of these different rules are actually affecting the vote?
Well, another hot button issue, another example is whether felons can vote, whether while they're in serving their time, after their sentences, or ever again. Every state sets those rules, and it's thought that there are some nearly 5 million people who are not allowed to cast ballots because of these different laws. Then there are different practices of culling or getting rid of names on voter rolls. Another prime example is absentee ballots and mail-in ballots. In 2020, some 65 million voters sent in their ballots by mail. This method has become incredibly popular. On the one hand, this is great because it ensures that more people pop their ballot in and can vote. These are potentially people who otherwise wouldn't vote because Election Day in the U.S. is not a holiday. It's not on a Sunday like here it is like here in France. But on the other hand, discarding ballots with minor errors like a missing signature or a missing date, can become more common in some states. And here the numbers that are thrown away can be quite staggering and important. In Pennsylvania, for example, 20,000 mail-in ballots were rejected in 2020. There were even more that were discarded in the last midterms. The wild thing, too, about Pennsylvania is that there is no fixed statewide rules on this. It is up to the 67 election boards, which are partisan, so they're either Democrat or Republican. It's up to them to decide what counts and what does not. And with Pennsylvania being the swing state of swing states, well, such votes could really matter. So you could argue that these different rules are indeed a vulnerability for American democracy, but standardizing them with constitutional amendments, well, that would require a majority of lawmakers to agree nationwide, both in Congress and also in states. And currently, we're definitely not in such a bipartisan climate.
That is certainly true. Solange, thank you so much. It's such fascinating stuff, even for those of us who are American, should know some of this already. I guess the important thing is if you can vote, do.
Yes,
Solange Mougin,
totally
thank you
agree.
so much for sharing all of that with us here on France 24.